So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Geneva Trade Week and to this session on trade and trade policy in the fight against plastic pollution. What are the opportunities and challenges? So my name is Carolyn Deer-Burbeck, and I'm a senior researcher here at in Geneva at the Graduate Institute's Global Governance Center. So apologies for running a few minutes late. We're waiting for one of our speakers, but we thought we should get started. So I'm delighted to moderate our session on behalf of our 6 co-hosts today, the Global Governance Center, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD, the UN Environment and Trade Hub, the Pew Charitable Trust, the Center for International Environmental Law, and the World Economic Forum. This session today is also part of a research project at the Graduate Institute on transforming the global plastics economy, which is supported by the Swiss Network of International Studies. So I'd like to gratefully acknowledge their support. Now, the fact that we have 6 organizations here today representing a diversity of perspectives and expertise on this topic is a strong indication of growing interest in the role of trade in the plastics economy and in plastics pollution. To set the scene, in my mind, a few key facts should inform our discussion today. The first is that the plastics economy is global and it's growing. Business as usual projections are for a further quadrupling of production from current levels by 2050. The largest category of that production, over 35%, is used for single-use plastic packaging. Less than 14 to 18% of plastics are recycled. Another 14% are incinerated, 40% are landfilled, and 32% leaks into our environment. Now, in terms of leakage into the environment, we've all seen a sort of remarkable and troubling images of marine plastic pollution, both due to marine litter and to microplastic pollution. But the environmental impacts of plastic pollution are not only in our oceans, but also on our land, in water streams, on roads, fields, sewage systems, in our air and in our soils. And these environmental impacts and the health impacts associated with them occur across the life cycle of plastics, from extraction through production and to disposal, and they also have significant economic costs. There's no doubt that plastic is an amazingly versatile and useful product. It's everywhere, all around us. It's used across sectors and for a stunning array of products, which also means that the scale and scope of the plastic pollution challenge and of transforming the sector toward greater sustainability are huge. So more recycling, better waste management, and cleaning up of existing pollution are definitely important. But in a growing number of countries, national environmental policymakers are increasingly looking upstream too, toward reducing unsustainable production and wasteful consumption of conventional plastics in the first place, and promoting transition towards more sustainable, low carbon, and circular plastic economies. Now, at the national level, many governments are also implementing trade-related measures, both to tackle plastic pollution, such as through bans or import restrictions on plastic waste and certain plastic products. At the same time, many governments pursue trade policies that aim to support or expand their national plastics industries and exports. And many countries rely on plastic imports for their use in their manufacturing sectors. So at the international level, we have an array of commitments and resolutions on reducing plastic pollution. On the trade front, most of you will be aware that in 2019, over 180 governments agreed to the plastics amendments to the Basel Convention, which we'll hear about later today, bringing in new requirements to better regulate trade in plastic waste. And yet significantly more remains to be done if the international community is going to tackle plastic pollution, including through stronger coherence of trade, development, and environmental policies. So to advance discussion on this issue of coherence and on the potential role of trade policy, our session today is focused on 4 questions. What's the state of play in plastic trade flows and trade-related actions to reduce plastic pollution? Where and how can trade and trade policy threaten or hamper efforts to reduce plastic pollution? And how could international cooperation on trade, whether in multilateral environment agreements, through trade agreements at the WTO or elsewhere, support efforts to reduce plastic pollution? And in that context, what are the opportunities to harness trade policy to tackle plastic pollution and encourage a more circular plastics economy? So to guide us through these questions, we have an excellent set of speakers today. The first hour of the session will be devoted to presentations, followed by a half hour of discussion. So during the session, please do post any comments or questions for panelists on the chat or in the Q&A box, and we'll try and take up at least some of these during the discussion. You can also post links to resources that you'd like to share, and some of the speakers will also paste links to recent research that they have published. So I'm just trying to see if Alan Wolf is now with us. I don't believe he's yet here. So we're going to skip to our first speaker on the panel, who is Winnie Lau. Winnie is the Senior Manager on Preventing Ocean Plastics at the Pew Charitable Trusts. And she's going to set the scene with some of the latest scientific evidence on what it will take to break the wave of ocean plastic pollution. And just to do some publicity for Winnie, her work featured this month on the front page of Science magazine. It does a wonderful job of highlighting the challenges at hand with plastic pollution and some of the ways in which we could address this. So Winnie, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here to be sharing with you the findings of our latest research that we just published to evaluate the effectiveness and scale of different global solutions and strategies to reduce plastic waste going into the ocean, as well as the environment at large. We published the findings in a report called Breaking the Plastic Wave, and as Carolyn said, an accompanying paper in the journal Science. And this was a very big endeavor, and so we couldn't have done this work without our thought partners. Next slide, please. So we did this work together with our partners, Systemic, and 4 thought partners: the University of Oxford, the University of Leeds, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and Common Seas. Next slide, please. So when we started looking into the plastic pollution issue about 3 or 4 years ago to see how Pew could help add value, we realized that there was a lot of activity already going on and many groups already working on the issue. And there were a lot of assumptions that were being made as well about what could solve the plastic pollution problem, with the debate centering around 5 main proposed strategies that are here at the top of this slide. But at the same time, there was a lack of evidence about how each of them performed environmentally, economically, and socially for different plastic materials and in different geographies. It was also not known what the costs and benefits associated with each of these strategies were, as well as the timelines that we're looking at in order to implement them. So we decided to take on this research to understand the solutions and their potential effectiveness. Together with our 4 thought partners and our partner Systemic, and a panel of 17 global experts, we developed a computer model, a conceptual model, and analyzed different scenarios. Next slide, please. So here's basically the main findings of our research in one graph. So first is that we found that there are no silver bullets to solving this problem. And what you'll see here is a projection of plastic waste going into the ocean between 2016 and 2040. And the red line at the top is our projection of business as usual. So if we don't change our current trajectory, that's what our analysis show would get to. And that's about 3 times as much plastic going into the ocean as what we're seeing today. And of course, governments and businesses have made commitments to reducing plastic pollution. And based on the current commitments as of made as of last year, we found that they can be effective, but that at the current scale of the commitments, it's only going to make a very small dent in the projected problem. And in fact, it's about a 7% reduction from 2040 projected levels. And then what you'll see in the middle clump, the bluish color lines in the middle, they represent the single strategy, single solution strategies that have been proposed. So recycling, can we recycle our way out of it? Some have proposed, increasing efforts, significant efforts around upstream solutions, reduction and substitution. Can we solve the problem that way? And yet others have proposed it as a waste management problem. If we can collect and dispose of all of the plastic waste generated, we would be able to stop plastic pollution. And as you can see in this graph, these single strategy solutions have an impact over projected business as usual amounts, but they really just kind of keep us at about status quo, where we're today. It's not really going to drop plastic pollution going into the ocean from where we are today. And so what we did was then look at one more scenario where we implemented all of the solutions, all of the known solutions at feasible, maximum feasible rates. And we call this the system change scenario. And when we did that, we found that we can start to bend this curve of plastic pollution going into the environment, and in fact, can reduce it by almost 80% from 2040 projected levels. So that's the good news. We have the tools we need today. We have the tools today in order to significantly reduce plastic pollution. Next slide, please. So here's a summary of the impact of the various interventions we modeled. So we modeled 4 main categories of interventions. Reduction, so eliminating unnecessary plastic, switching to reuse models, new delivery systems, and we found that we could reduce about 1/3 of the plastic production in 2040 by really maximizing reduction interventions. We could also substitute about a sixth of the plastic production away with paper and compostable materials. And then recycling also features as a solution, increasing mechanical recycling, but of course we'll have to increase collection rates because you can only recycle what you collect. Then working with manufacturers and companies to design products for recycling, more easier recycling. And then the things that we cannot reduce, substitute, or recycle away, we'll have to properly dispose of them through controlled disposal with facilities that can properly manage the waste. And then lastly, we also looked at reducing waste export from high-income countries to middle and low-income countries by about 90%. And then also we also looked at the category of primary microplastics. These are the microplastics that first enters the environment as microplastics rather than the breakdown of plastic that's already in the environment. And rolling out known solutions, we can reduce a significant chunk of microplastics going into the environment. But I want to say that these impacts of these various solutions are compounded, which means that they are integrated and they are there's a synergy between them. So for example, if a plastic is eliminated, then it will no longer need to be recycled or disposed. But if we don't do that, then that'll put pressure on the recycling and disposal part of the system. Next slide, please. And lastly, we also looked at there were a lot of details in the modeling, and we broke down the analysis by different income groups and whether populations were in urban or rural centers, and also by plastic type. I'm not going to go into all of that. That's in our report, and I'll post the link after my presentation. But what we found is that there are differences, and we saw that middle and low income countries has about half of the global share of plastic production, but we estimated that about 85% of the leakage come from middle income countries. So in addition to looking at, because of this, in addition to looking at plastic reduction in production, substitution, recycling, and waste disposal, we, as I said, also modeled waste export reduction from high-income countries to middle and low-income countries. And we modeled the 90% reduction in export. And what we found that was that in 2040, that could amount to a reduction of 5 million metric tons per year. And that's about the same amount of plastic we saw that would be going into the environment under the best case scenario. So it'll be important to explore the policies, the international policies that can help improve the management of trade, plastic waste trade. So to summarize our research findings, we found that plastic pollution is a multifaceted problem and that there are no silver bullets, and it's going to take solutions across the whole system involving all stakeholders to solve this problem. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Winnie, for that excellent, really interesting overview. And really, I think the reason I had been so grateful that you're speaking today is to give us this broad system change scenario to really underscore this point that there's not a single solution and that we'll need to combine multiple approaches. And that is also, I think, relevant in the trade policy arena as well, that we'll need to look for ways in which trade policy can help with different aspects of this system change. You closed your remarks by mentioning the importance of looking at how better to regulate plastic waste trade, which is the perfect segue into the remarks from Carlos, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions at UNEP. So Carlos, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I would like to start congratulating the Graduate Institute, EU Trust, Your Environment, UNCTAD, CIEL, WF, and SNIS for the opportunity to organize this event. I think it's very timely and very good. I would like to start, if you can put the first slide, please, saying that plastics have extremely useful properties. They help us to keep our food fresh. They make it possible to safely operate electrical devices and create various solutions in the medical field, for example, as we have seen during the coronavirus pandemic crisis. However, the plastic pollution has negative effects on human health and the environment, as well as on our climate. Plastics and microplastics end up in soil, rivers, and finally in the oceans, even in our drink and food. Plastic pollution leads to biodiversity losses and chemical production from hazardous additives as well. The production and burning of plastics products cause greenhouse gas emissions that accelerate climate change in addition. If you can please put the second slide. This was the background against why in 2019 the United Nations Environment Assembly noted with concern that the high and rapid increase in levels of marine litter, including plastic litter and microplastics, represent a serious environmental problem at the global scale. It was echoed by the Conference of the Parties of the Basel Convention at its 14th meeting in 2019. As huge amounts of plastics and plastic waste are being shipped across the international borders every day, trade remains a critical dimension to be addressed. Some countries have already put in place severe restrictions on imports of plastic waste. Can you please pass to the next slide? Conscious of the challenge posed by the global plastic pollution and the important role of transboundary movements of plastic waste, in May 2019, the Conference of the Parties to the Basel Convention, through decision BC 14/12, adopted the plastic waste management amendments with the objectives of enhancing the control of the transboundary movements of plastic waste and clarifying the scope of the Convention as it applies to such waste. The new entries will become effective the 1st of January 2021, in a few months' time. The amendments made plastic waste, including mixtures of such wastes, as well as the plastic waste presumed to be hazardous, subject to the prior informed consent procedure under the Convention, meaning that exporting countries will need to formally obtain the decisions of importing countries as to whether they wish to receive future shipments of such plastic waste, and ensuring that the importing countries have the capacity to manage plastic waste in an environmentally sound manner. Plastic waste, that is is as a destination for recycling in an environmentally sound manner and almost free from contamination and other types of waste, will not be subject to the problem from consent. So this is not a ban on the use of or transport of any kind of plastics. It's only those plastics that are considered to be hazardous or creating special problems. And so those that are not meeting these conditions could be freely traded, so that recycling of waste, of plastic waste across the globe would remain possible in line with the circular economy. The Plastic Waste Amendment has thus strengthened the Basel Convention as the only global legally binding instrument so far to specifically address plastic waste. It will make global trade in plastics more transparent and better regulated than it was in the past. If you can please pass to the next slide. In all this, the international cooperation is critical. The VR Secretariat is already cooperating closely with other multilateral environmental agreements, as well as with the intergovernmental organizations such as WTO, the OECD, WCO, Interpol, IMO, and many others that will be very long to mention here. Deepening in such cooperation will be critical. For example, regulating trade in plastic waste can play an important role in achieving the objectives of a circular economy and providing an enabling environment, in particular to eliminate exports of contaminated and hazardous plastics waste to developing countries, while allowing those countries with the technology to ensure that the value of plastic waste is retained for their own economy. So we believe that these plastic amendments will in fact trigger the economic activity in an environmentally sound manner in many parts of the world where it was not the case until now. This can only be achieved through a fruitful collaboration between all concerned actors, such as the Basel Convention, WTO, Interpol, etc., as I mentioned before. Such cooperation is equally essential when it comes to fighting the continuous problem of illegal traffic in plastic waste. Enforcement operations called Demeter, led by the WCO, provide valuable information on illegal waste trade. The most recent Demeter 5 operation was launched by China, Customs, and WCO, and target the illegal transboundary movement of waste and illegal trade in ozone-depleting substances, with the objective of identifying emerging, importing, and exporting countries and regions. There were 232 seizures of target goods, including 201 cases of waste, most of which were seized during the importation period. Plastic waste, alongside with the waste of electric and electronic equipment, metal scraps, waste in vehicle parts, and municipal waste dominated the terms of both number of cases and quantity. The data demonstrates that there are significant changes over the years. The seizure action of plastic waste interventions has increased by twofold. So it's more and more illegal trade of waste, plastic waste going on. Often plastics are mixed with hazardous waste to disguise the illegal shipments, therefore, and thus become contaminated. Hazardous waste contained plastics is also often exported legally under the guise of recovery. This highlights how important it is to ensure that trade in plastics and plastic waste is done in accordance with international provisions and standards, in particular the Basel Convention, if we want to truly build that circular economy. The plastic circular economy is a model for a closed system that promotes the reuse of plastics products, generates value from waste, and avoids sending recoverable plastics to landfill. And here I should stress that some people simply link the Basel Convention with amendments on the restriction of transboundary movements, but the Basel Convention addresses the problem of plastics in many other ways, including providing guidance on sound environmental management of plastic waste, and therefore also further than that, the Convention has some provisions on how to address the root problem of waste, that is the production of the waste itself, so how to minimize and how to reduce the waste as a whole. In this is an area of work that international community still, in my point of view, have a long way to go to fill this gap. Plastic waste is a valuable resource that can be used to produce new plastic raw materials and manufacture plastic parts and products, or to generate energy when recycling is not viable. Meantime, we cannot ignore the continued need to address the still poorly developed waste management system in many countries. Cooperation to strengthen these capacities remains critical. If we want to prevent the transboundary movement of waste, we must enhance the capabilities of countries, in particular developing countries, to manage the loads of waste that they have. For recycling, separate collection is key. More than half of all post-consumer plastic waste is collected through different mixed waste collection schemes in which the share of plastics range from 2 to 8%. Most recycled plastics come from waste that is collected separately at home or in commercial activities, and consumers therefore play an important part in the effort to recycle more plastics. Awareness of the challenge of managing plastic waste is unfortunately still low in many countries, though we have seen significant progress in this area. At the same time, the plastic waste challenges needs to be tackled at source. As I said, we have to prevent the waste to happen in the first instance and to minimize the waste as much as possible. Therefore, many initiatives are underway to promote innovative designs, alternative, and as well as to reduce the use of single-use plastics. If you can please just put the closing slide, I'm finishing now. We believe that we need to accelerate our efforts to strengthen the waste management and recycling systems while simultaneously reducing our plastic footprint and finding more environmental friendly alternatives. International cooperation in trade has a critical role to play in this transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for that excellent overview of the plastic amendments. Two key points I took away from your comments were that on one side, the amendments are really focused on reducing trade in plastic waste that cannot be recycled and illegal trafficking, while at the same time working to enable a more circular economy. I also noted that you mentioned the opportunity for further work in the context of Basel in terms of reducing the generation of waste in the first place and in boosting cooperation around waste management. You also mentioned the importance of collaboration among agencies like the World Customs Organization, Interpol, and the WTO. And on that note, I would like to give the floor now to Alan Wolf, who's been able to join us a little late for the introductory remarks, that we will fit him in here, which is perfect. So Alan is the Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. He's been a leading voice within the multilateral trading system on the importance of members harnessing the WTO and the multilateral platform it provides to respond to key public policy challenges of our time, with environmental sustainability being high on that list. And as part of the wider WTO reform agenda, he's also been a leading voice in supporting members to find new ways and new approaches to working together. So Alan, you have the floor.
Carolyn, thank you very much. My apologies for being late, not for lack of trying. It would have been easier during the 45 minutes I could have walked over to the institute with time to spare. I thank you for the invitation to the Graduate Institute, inviting me to join this panel of very distinguished individuals on a very important subject. Those of us in the WTO community, several hundred in the Secretariat, the ambassadors, the missions, the representatives of 20 countries, over 20 countries seeking to join the WTO, have one central purpose. They're stewards of the international trading system to assure that trade, the lifeblood of the world economy, underwrites the well-being of the world's peoples. The tools that the trading system started out with were very basic: remove quantitative restrictions, lower tariffs, live by a few basic principles such as non-discrimination, transparency, and a handful of others identified most recently last week at the G20 trade ministers meeting in the Riyadh initiative by the chair, the presidency of the G20, the Saudi Arabian delegation, listed other principles that are now agreed by all members. With the creation of the WTO 25 years ago, members broadened their horizons to understand the need for stewardship of the planet, not just the trade on the planet. The objective of sustainable development is in the very first paragraph of our founding agreement. The adoption of Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 added momentum, most clearly in the case of seeking to discipline fisheries subsidies, the one negotiation that all 164 members of the WTO are committed to bring to a successful conclusion within a matter of months. We in Geneva are fortunate to have in this panel a number of experts on another emerging area of trade concern for our members, plastics pollution. Had the pandemic not disrupted the course of events this year, our members would have been gathered in Nur-Sultan in Kazakhstan in June, and a subject that would have been on the agenda of many of those who were in attendance would have been exploring the linkages between plastics pollution and trade. The 12th ministerial, which is now scheduled for next year, will take place, and I'm sure that members of the WTO will again want to raise the subject of plastics. Won't have gone away, and this panel actually helps further discussion of what the WTO can contribute. So I have 3 points, 3 basic points. The first is coherence. Tackling plastic pollution and moving towards better plastics trade will require coordination, collective action along the entire supply chain from a range of stakeholders, including policymakers, producers, and consumers. Trade and trade policy can be part of the solution. Trade policies can help promote trade in goods and services that support broader efforts to reduce plastic pollution. Trade can also provide opportunities to gain access to world-class waste management solutions and to participate in supply chains for less polluting alternatives. Trade can help to scale up solutions that facilitate a transition to a sustainable and circular plastics economy. So policy coherence is required to harness the opportunities and minimize the challenges. In the WTO, the Committee on Trade and the Environment, CTE, offers a valuable and unique platform to explore the mutual supportiveness of trade and environmental policies. Over the years, the committee has become a key channel of communication, coordination, and cooperation between the global trading system and several multilateral environmental agreements, not least the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions. What we're learning from our work with these conventions and others is that there are many worthy efforts currently underway to tackle plastics pollution, which underscores the need to think carefully and creatively about what the WTO could do to support and boost these efforts. Second topic, transparency. Trade regulations, import, export, transit restrictions, public procurement practices, border or internal taxes, subsidies that are incentives are some of the tools in the trade policy toolkit that can be redeployed to address plastic pollution. And I know that our moderator has a number of thoughts in this area. Transparency can help share knowledge and best practices, including predictability in trade relations. Shedding light on measures that will be or are being taken can also help curb disguised trade protection. That's why the WTO Secretariat spends considerable effort to make available the WTO Environmental Database, a unique window into all environment-related notifications submitted by WTO members, along with the environmental measures that are taken up in the WTO trade policy reviews. Between 2009 and 2018, WTO members notified 128 measures affecting trade in plastics for environmental reasons. By helping to keep track of trade measures to combat plastic pollution, the database provides a factual basis to inform evidence-based discussions on what national governments are already doing and where further action or coordination may be needed. Third point, action. Challenges create opportunities. The disruption caused by the pandemic is an opportunity to consider how the trading system can best respond to crises, which in that case, in the case of the health crisis, consists of dealing with a scarcity of medical goods. If it is agreed by our members that plastics pollution is a global crisis requiring concerted trade action, the WTO community can consider options for concrete actions that the WTO can take in the trade field to expand opportunities and overcome challenges to reduce plastic pollution. WTO member-led initiatives and discussions, including at the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment, on the cross-border implications of plastic pollution, have raised awareness of the trade dimensions and provided a platform to share experiences and best practices. The committee has also been discussing the broader theme of the circular economy, not least what trade facilitating measures would be needed to support reverse supply chains. These discussions can inform members of how a WTO plastics initiative at the next ministerial MC12 now tentatively in Nur Sultan in June of 2021, which we hope will take place, COVID-19 permitting, but things are getting a little bit better, so we'll hope for the best. We'll see what that ministerial could contribute. Trade and trade policy could also accelerate technology dissemination and spur R&D for better plastics trade. Members may wish to consider, that's WTO members, may wish to consider reviving the Environmental Goods Agreement as a powerful tool to facilitate trade in environmental goods and services, including less polluting alternatives and inputs to biodegradable plastics. I mean, the fact is, since the EGA went into a quiet period of non-activity, there's a time to rethink what the EGA should be doing in the current circumstances with respect to plastics pollution and other current concerns. Today's panel, bringing together expertise on promising initiatives that exist and could be launched, can contribute to moving the problem of plastics pollution towards solutions relevant to the WTO's work. And I look forward to hearing your conclusions and your contributions to making the trading system more responsive to the environmental needs of our time. Thank you very much.
I really thank you for highlighting the existing interest of a diversity of members, of WTO members in this topic of plastic pollution. And indeed, there have been a number of informal consultations and discussions over the past year at the WTO. It was a major item of discussion at July's Committee on Trade and Environment meeting, and is closely linked, as you say, to wider discussions on circular economy at the WTO. So I won't summarize your many very concrete suggestions of how members can harness trade policy, but really appreciate the dual focus both on coherence and on transparency. So I think with this, we'll turn next to our next speakers, who are colleagues from UNCTAD. I'd like to introduce Diana Barakloff, Steve McFeely, and David Vivas, who are going to impress us with their teamwork by sharing a single presentation drawing on recent research on trade and plastics from across 3 UNCTAD divisions, and notably that also highlights the potential for cooperation among international organizations, as they will be presenting some research based on the environment database that Alan Wolf mentioned, that's hosted by the WTO. So Diana, I believe you're going first. You have the floor.
Thank you, Carolyn, and we will do our best to, as we say, live up to those standards of showing some coherency. In fact, I'm going to interrupt you and say David is going first, if that's possible.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Diana. It's a real pleasure. It's also great to be part of this team and also be part of this panel with great partners such as UNEP, you, CIEL, etc. I'm a former CIEL staff, so I'm very happy to see that we're also working back together. The presentation of Mr. Wolf makes my life very easy because I can, from his speech and also from the point of view, go deeper into the analysis. I'm going to share the screen, or Caroline, do you have the presentation? How should I proceed? Should I share? I cannot share the screen. Do you have the presentation?
Just say next slide.
You just say next slide.
Next slide. So first, as Mr. Wolf mentioned, there have been some discussions in the WTO CTE on the issue of plastics, especially during the July session. Here I have a slide where you can derive many messages. The slide basically reflects some UNCTAD analysis that we made into a submission to the CTE this summer, where we analyzed the notifications by WTO members that you can find in the Trade and Environment database in relation to plastics in a general manner, meaning plastics plus other products, and specifically in plastics. What we can see is that while initially there were a significant number of measures being notified on plastics in an horizontal manner with other products, there have been incremental number of notifications, specifically on plastics and surrounding environmental concerns about plastics. They have been a growth of 28% annually on the number of these notifications over the last 10 years. That's a lot. But also in the last 2 years, the number of notifications has specifically on trade measures related to plastics have skyrocketed to 86% more than any other measures on horizontal level. So this slide shows you that members themselves, I'm not talking about here about IGOs, NGOs, civil society activists, no, member states are very concerned about the effects on plastics are implementing trade measures today to a great number. This is the first elements of the finding. The second element, next slide, please, is that we have done an analysis of how these notifications are linked to WTO agreements, what's their content, and who's notifying them. It's interesting to note that most of the notifications have been done by developing countries, 71%. This is a very important number. So it seems that developing countries are very concerned about plastic waste. They're very concerned about single-use plastics. LDCs have notified 13% of the measures, and developed countries only 17%. That shows that this is becoming a development issue. It's not only a trade issue. In the nature of the notifications, you know that across the board, most of the notifications are related to the agreement on trade and the technical barriers to trade are technical notifications on both sides, both developing countries, developed countries, and even LDCs. But you have a difference in the type of measures that developed countries tend to apply versus what developing countries tend to apply. Developed countries tend to focus more on measures related to the quality, on measures related to subsidies and grants, and measures related to technical characteristics of the product. Developing countries are applying measures more in relation to quantitative measures, meaning bans, prohibitions, but also in relation to import restrictions. So they are very concerned of what's coming in, and in many cases have taken measures to stop those flows, not only in terms of trade, but also in terms of production and imports. So, and the main target has been, of all these notifications, the most common type of notifications is about single-use plastics of bags, containers, boxes, straws, etc., etc., etc. So they are very concerned about the type of consumer goods that will have, or packaging that will have a direct impact on pollution, on polluting their oceans, their land, etc. Or link also to the impossibility to recycle them or to manage the type of waste produced by it. Interestingly, also, I don't have here in the chart, but I've been doing some recent research with Diana. I was also checking on SIDS, small island development states, and I found 9 notifications from these states. Again, all of them related to single-use plastics on the products I just mentioned. But also, I find out that there are many WTO members that have implemented those measures that have not yet notified. On the seed side, for example, I found 6 countries that have implemented bans and different type of measures of plastic that have not yet notified to the WTO. So the WTO gives us a universe that may be much bigger in practice on the number of trade measures that are put in practice. Another point that comes from this chart is a big question about, shall we continue like that, that each country start notifying unilaterally the measures they take? Shall we start discussing how trade measures related to plastic should look like? What should be their content? Do we need international cooperation? Do we need a harmonized procedure? Because it's looking that these are blooming, but they are not necessarily being coordinated, discussed at international level. The next slide, please. Again, all these points are our regulatory measures. Next slide, please. Yes. This is also an illustrative list that we presented to the committee. And this is very much linked to this, to one of the points that was mentioned by Pew recently on the issue of substitutes, but it's also linked to the point presented by Mr. Wolf on environmental goods and services negotiations. First, we need to start thinking that there may be many products that can perform similar functions of those of several plastics that have a much better properties in terms of health, meaning non-toxics, or in terms of environmental impacts. In the case of Pew in the slide some minutes ago, they were presenting basically paper and cardboard, but there are many other products that perform similar, again, functions, sometimes even better. Examples presented in the list, including glass, pottery, ceramics, natural fibers, rice husk, but also corn husk, and many different types of organic waste, such as bagasse, that sometimes is not used. You have different types of animal proteins. You can also use natural rubbers that have been there forever, and even you can raise forests again to stop carbon. So there are many other substitutes that we need to explore. The Graduate Institute and Pew are doing some research on the matter. UNCTAD is going to start also doing a deeper research on the matter, especially looking at the life cycle of these products and see how effective they can be as substitutes and their potential for scaling up in industrial terms. Many developing countries are big producers of these products, especially in the field of natural fibers, are there today. They can substitute many products already in the clothing realm, but also in the packaging realm today. With current technology, we can innovate about, we can redesign, but we can do this change today. And this is the beauty of thinking of substitutes that are, in our case, non-plastics. We're not talking about bioplastics here. We're talking about other products than plastics that we have at hand. And I'm making this point strongly for one reason. The issue of environmental goods and services was mentioned a few minutes ago, but that negotiation was mainly focused on industrial products. It didn't include many natural products. It didn't include biodiversity-based products. It didn't include agricultural products. That was a big disincentive for many developing countries to engage in that negotiation. So I think if you want to make a negotiation fruitful and constructive, you also need to look at the interests of many countries in their supply side capacity and their trade capacities. So many of these plastic substitutes could be scaled up and could be traded more if we define the right incentives at the multilateral level. So a big call to make any future environmental goods and service negotiation, not only about industrial products, but also about agricultural products and other products. And I leave now to Diana. Sorry for being too long.
Thank you. Next slide, please. This is Steve going to address the trade slides.
So good evening, everybody. This is just a quick update on the statistical part of the project. So we began earlier, in fact, last year, working on preliminary data. So the data set that we've used is the United Nations Comtrade. And based on a list of plastics provided by Carolyn, these are just some preliminary estimates of the flows of plastic on an annual basis. What we should note here is that these are repurposed data, so that they're not designed to capture plastic. So as the note on the side says, a lot of the embedded plastic inside other products like telephones, all sorts of things aren't actually captured, and this is just kind of pure plastic products. And then a lot of packaging isn't captured either. What we're setting out to do now is build a more refined data set. So already Caroline is working on a revised list of plastics for us. And then we're going to use Comtrade. So again, building this data set isn't straightforward because, as I said, we're using a generic trade data set. So the disadvantage is we can't capture all of the plastic products easily. The advantage, though, is that the estimates that we have sit naturally within the trade universe, so we can compare plastic to all the other trade flows. So it gives the data some context. We're looking at building a data set that straddles 20 years, which means we're straddling 5 different generations of HS6 code, which isn't a trivial matter, as Caroline now knows, because she's having to recode the stuff. So what's our plan? So our plan is to launch 2 data sets effectively. So later this year, we hope to launch the total trade in plastics data set, And that's a data set by country and by product. So that's roughly a matrix of about 200 times 450 per year, which is roughly the prototype data set that we've built. Then the more complex ambition is to also build a bilateral flows plastics trade database, which will be country by product, which is roughly a matrix of about 90,000 times 90,000. So when you look over the 20 years, we're looking at roughly about 164 million records between the two data sets. So that's the type of size that we're talking about. So we hope to build the total trade data set this year. The bilateral flows next year, that will take a bit more time because there'll be a lot more imputation. And then once we have those basic data sets in place, then we can start looking with colleagues like yourselves on the complementary indicators that we normally build. We could start building them for plastics as well. So we could start looking at complementary indicators such as plastic dependency, plastic concentration, plastic diversification, and so forth. So that's a very quick update for me. And now it's over to Diana. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. So if I can just very quickly just speak to the slide that we have at the moment. As Steve has explained to you, it was quite a process to get this far. You know, they're dealing with very complicated HS codes and ingredients that are very long scientific words that are unpronounceable for most of us. But using this with a So starting from the very primary form, when it's just a tiny little pellet or a tiny little piece of plastic smaller than your fingernail, and then looking at how it becomes used in other products, including intermediate and final products. And what I think is just interesting, just to have a first take on this, and as I say, these are very preliminary data that, you know, a bit of a health warning, we're still working on it. But, you know, the plastic trade is $1.6 trillion at the moment, which is, you know, quite significant if we think of global trade at the same year of $20 trillion. Then let's look at plastic waste, which is what most of us spend a lot of attention on. You see, that might be the issue that we're concerned about from the point of view of pollution, but it's quite small compared to some of the other levels of plastic. I mean, plastic waste traded value is $3 billion. And yet look at the value of, for example, plastic fibers or plastic intermediate goods. The plastic fiber one was almost $200 billion last year. That's been incorporated in intermediate forms of plastic in that slide. And then plastic packaging, which was what David was talking about, some of the alternatives. You see that's worth, this is third to bottom row, $53 billion. So, you know, we heard from Mr. Wolf, the WTO, that there are opportunities as well as challenges. Well, you know, plastic packaging is an opportunity for some countries that is measured in the tens of billions of dollars. So may I have the next slide, please? Just to very quickly give you a little snapshot of what the data preliminary looks like, what we see is that plastics is complicated. It's very multifaceted and multidimensional. Countries that are big exporters of plastic products are also big importers of plastic products. Importers either in raw materials or in intermediate materials. And so we see immediately why this is so difficult, because plastics have been for many countries a really important way of climbing the value chain and diversifying their economy. So as we've heard from other speakers, if we want to have the, what was it called at the beginning? Our first speaker talked about a total system change. Our speaker from Pew, system change scenario. You see, this is amazingly complicated because we have so many countries involved at all different levels of the plastic life cycle. May I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So just thinking about, you know, what are some of the mechanisms that we might be interested in learning more about and exploring more, to how we can support these efforts by countries to reduce excessive use of plastic and reduce plastic waste. Now, there's a lot of information on this slide, and I don't expect you to take it all on board now. But first of all, just look at the structure of the slide. We've got a left-hand side and a right-hand side, two columns. So the left-hand column is thinking about how do we actually transform our economies away from excessive use of plastic. And then the slide on the right-hand side of the slide is looking at that process by which we have transformation, because unless the process is equitable and just, it will never be sustainable. And so here's another of the challenges. If we want to move away from excessive use and indeed excessive trade in plastic, we're going to have to confront the fact that plastics is a big business employing millions of people, and that it's been a very important path for countries to diversify their economies. So just some of the measures in the green, if your eyes are good enough to read this slide, some of the words are in green. They are related to trade policies. So looking at trade policies or rules or regulations to go to more sustainable production, for example. This might include policies with regard to producer responsibility. Now, some producers are already taking responsibility. There's strong corporate support for these moves as well, but it'll be more effective if we also have it supported by regulatory framework and structures. Then we think of trade policies to support the national efforts to reduce unsustainable production and consumption and to encourage alternatives. So these are issues that the trade community will be thinking about. This helps build on what Steve was saying, our next steps with the data set. We want to also have these complementary indicators about dependency and concentration, and that will help us think about how to use these trade policies. Correct pricing is obviously really important. This is an issue particularly with regard to single-use plastic. Plastic bags are just incredibly cheap. They're so cheap, and they're getting cheaper as the price of oil goes down. And countries are trying to put bans on plastic bags, but they're also incredibly useful. And what happens in terms of supporting firms that are based on making plastic bags or that use plastic bags? How do we get them to make that change? So, we have a time constraint, and I'm going to end now, but just to say there's plenty of material to discuss if we have questions from you later, and thank you for your attention so far. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much to our team from UNCTAD, and thank you for presenting all of that research and information. This is a pretty new area of analysis, of policy analysis, and so getting together this data is super important. Also, if we want to look not only downstream at plastic waste trade, but upstream at all the other at the role of trade across the plastics economy more broadly. So we feel that this is really important research to try and inform the policy discussions and identify where the challenges lie going forward. I'm now going to swiftly turn the floor to Carol Moffat, who is the President and CEO of the Center for International Environmental Law. The CIEL is also strongly involved with the providing legal advice to the Break Free from Plastic movement. We're really delighted to have them as part of our panel today. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Just for the audience, I just want to note that because we started about 10 minutes late, we will run a little over, so we will have time at the end after Carol and Kristen for comments and discussion. With that, Carol, you have the floor.
Thanks, Carolyn. And I think the conversation today has been a really helpful one. I think it is really important to recognize, as we heard in the earlier interventions, that the health impacts, the environmental impacts, the impacts to food systems and to climate that we're seeing from plastic are not simply a matter of plastic pollution. Those impacts are occurring at every stage of the plastic life cycle, and therefore it's really critical that we begin to think of plastic holistically. And I think plastic's impacts on the climate are emblematic of that. A great deal of attention has gone into the plastics that are showing up in the ocean and increasingly in water supplies, but plastics are also having a profound impact on our ability to meet long-term climate objectives. On our present trajectories, if plastic growth continues as planned, by 2013, emissions from the production, use, and disposal of plastics could reach 1.34 gigatons per year. And that's equivalent to adding almost 300 new 500 megawatt coal-fired power plants, emitting 7 days a week, 365 days a year, year-round. If we look out to 2050, those emissions grow to 56 gigatons, which is equivalent to almost 13% of the Earth's entire remaining carbon budget. And so I note this because any approach to dealing with the plastics crisis needs to begin where plastics begin, at the wellheads and drill pads where plastics are created. It needs to look at production systems. It needs to look at consumer goods. And yes, at the very end, it needs to look at waste disposal and management issues, but those are only a piece of the puzzle. So what we need is a really holistic approach. And ultimately, the simplest, the surest, the most efficient, and most effective ways to reduce the harms that we're seeing from plastics are to reduce the amount of plastics entering our economy in the first place. Trade policy can play a really important role in this debate. And the first way that trade policy can play a really important role in solving the plastics crisis is to stop creating new problems. And we've seen that really acutely in recent investigative reporting out of the New York Times that disclosed collaboration between the United States government and the American Chemistry Council seeking to use the US-Kenya Free Trade Agreement negotiations to both block Kenya from adopting new regulations on plastic when Kenya has been playing a leadership role in the African region, and also use trade policy as a lever to get the country to actually roll back measures that it's already put into place. And at the same time, we see the industry working with the US government to actually try and instill investor state protections in a potential US-Kenya free trade agreement that would not only be a restraint on policy choices, but would chill regulators from taking the sort of action on plastics crisis that the Kenyan people have been demanding. And so I think it's really relevant when we talk about trade policy to recognize that the very first thing that trade negotiators can do is stop putting trade barriers into place for constructive trade action against plastics. Because what plastics are fundamentally is a form of fossil fuels, one of the most important things that trade policy can do to address the plastics crisis is to address the role of fossil fuels in the economy. For decades now, within the WTO, within the G20, within other policy fora, there's been ongoing recognition of the need to deal with fossil fuel subsidies. Addressing fossil fuel subsidies has benefits not only for the climate and the environment, but also for the struggle to address the plastics crisis. We know that more than $500 billion annually are going into unsustainable fossil fuel subsidies. In the wake of COVID-19, those figures have expanded dramatically. We've seen an estimated $200 billion go into new fossil fuel subsidies just as part of COVID-19 bailout efforts since January. So all of this means that one of the most important ways that trade policy can contribute to addressing the plastic crisis is addressing those perverse incentives that are driving the production of plastics at those ever cheaper levels that you were talking about. We've seen some positive steps in this regard. There is the work of the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform. There is the work of the Friends, Advancing Sustainable Trade Group, led by Costa Rica and by Canada. There are multiple routes to taking these questions on, and it would be good to see a candid debate about them within the WTO. That being said, I think I want to highlight that there are much more promising, much more powerful routes already underway in which the WTO and which the trade policy community can contribute by playing a supporting role. And the most important of those is with the growing momentum for a global plastic treaty. The United Nations Environmental Assembly has been working towards the development of a mandate to address the plastic pollution crisis and marine debris for the last several years. Increasingly, it is recognized that that agreement needs to, as we've talked about, deal with the entire life cycle of plastics, not just plastics in the marine environment. And so I think when CIEL looks at this issue and the intersection between the plastics crisis and trade regimes, what we see are, yes, absolutely opportunities to take really fundamental positive measures through attacking fossil fuel subsidies and other perverse incentives, and also equally fundamentally room for the trade space to help respond to the plastic crisis simply by no longer interfering with it. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Carol, for those three main points on keeping out of the way, making sure that we safeguard existing regulations, and evolving emerging efforts in countries to implement legislation efforts around plastic pollution. The second one was around fossil fuel subsidies and looking if there's a way that we can use trade disciplines or transparency to reduce those. And the third, also really looking at how we can support this global treaty on plastic pollution, and whether, I think in there, hopefully there's some scope for looking at trade-related actions within that, or looking at ways that they can, that efforts elsewhere can complement or and support that treaty process. So I'm going to turn swiftly now to our last speaker, Kristen, from the World Economic Forum. She's the director of the Global Plastic Action Partnership, and also is on the WEF's executive committee. Kristen, you have the floor, and thank you for your patience as being the last speaker.
No, thank you so much for that, Carolyn. Many thanks. Very lovely to be the last speaker after such wealth of knowledge shared here today. So again, thanks to you and the Institute for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak this afternoon. Interestingly, of course, being the last, I'm really going to do my very best not to repeat what has come before me, but possibly to illustrate or build on what the others are discussing as we look to address plastic pollution and waste through international trade policy. Again, a lot of really fantastic information already shared with everyone today. So I think I might even look to shorten some of my comments and not duplicate some of the points of view already shared. So as you probably know, the World Economic Forum is one of the world's leading organizations for public-private cooperation. And in doing so, they've pulled together the Global Plastic Action Partnership, a multi-stakeholder platform that's dedicated to addressing plastic waste and pollution by translating commitments to address this issue and turning them into very specific and concrete action. We work in a number of geographies and at the global level, and we're aiming to accelerate change through a number of different processes, but specifically focusing on three primary pillars of work. The first being to convene stakeholder communities and generate conversations, to pull together new insights, analysis, and develop action roadmaps, and finally, to mobilize finance and catalyze high potential solutions. So with that, we then are aiming to move the needle from awareness to action by catalyzing efforts and driving change in 6 predominant areas. One of those is informing policy. And in the informing policy space, we're looking to identify those policies and the regulatory frameworks, including and as pertaining to trade, that enable a supportive environment for addressing plastics waste and pollution. Excuse me. So whilst the Global Plastic Action Partnership is the forum's flagship program to combat plastic waste and pollution, we also work really, really closely with a lot of teams across the forum to deliver these game-changing solutions at a lot of different points throughout the value chain. And one of the key partners we work with is the Trade and Investment Platform. And together with the Trade and Investment Platform team, we composed a community of over 50 plus experts. Earlier this year, they came together to explore the challenges of plastics, the circular economy, and the role for global trade. Through discussions, insights have been shared on the challenges, the potentials to explore, and how we can address this. We then published a white paper in partnership with many of the people who are here today and even on this panel. So I'll thank each of you for your support and engagement in that process. The paper is clear about the challenges around trade flows, plastics, pollution, and a few of the outcomes that we really found were twofold. So first, countries' plastic waste is intended for recycling may have little oversight of treatment or destination, including where importing countries do not actually know or have the appropriate facilities. I think somebody even asked a question about this in the chat box. The second point is that there's a lot of illegal trade and mislabeling of plastic waste understood to be out there. So the paper is talking not just about the issues, but what are the opportunities that we can then address for trade to support action to address plastic pollution? And this is the space we really need to find a nuance, right? Because we believe there are a number of different angles we have to consider whilst having this conversation. First, the circular economy is a concept that sees products kept at their highest value and waste from one process as an input into another. Here, trade facilitation actions can be really helpful to complement the Basel Convention and the plastic waste amendments. So why is that the case? We think about, and some of the speakers prior have already talked about the January 2021 plastic waste that is sorted, clean, uncontaminated, and effectively designed for recycling can be traded freely, while other types will require consent from export, import, and transit countries. So how do we actually police that? And how can we get countries to rely on what constitutes clean, sorted, uncontaminated as a first best outcome? So definitely space here for us to work together to understand and understand that there are going to be more hurdles for this legitimate trade in plastic waste, where the end purpose is clearly the circular economy. Greater volumes of trash will simply flow through illegal channels. So we'd really like to find countries who can also then go beyond Basel, and they might actually look to impose their own import-export bans that businesses then have to try to navigate. So a lot of different nuances that we're talking about here. One place to look is that the EU is currently pursuing an approach to responsible plastic waste. The waste shipment regulation is being revised currently to ensure that non-hazardous plastic waste can still be traded with in a streamlined way. This would be happening within the bloc, while the EU strategy for plastics in a circular economy aims to scale recycling, improve waste management, promote innovation and new types of alternatives. So all these activities can generate jobs that include even in developing countries. So for example, one of our partners, a company we've been working really closely with, shared with us that an ocean-bound plastic waste collection initiative that they've been undertaking over the last year, the waste exported for recycling and reuse, they've generated 11,000 jobs in Haiti. And they believe that this can happen in other places with other initiatives, but only if they can have the ability to rely on the efficiently movement of materials across borders. So next, in this world of value chains, we think about the differences in standards, which again, I think has been mentioned today. Whether these standards are on recycled plastic, production, use or labeling, there are a number of challenges that then business have to try to adapt. And sometimes this means they divert certain requirements. There's also very little data available on alternatives or recycled plastic, let alone the data that Winnie's trying to uncover with her model. And the latter is particularly problematic since trade data doesn't really allow currently for the disaggregation between the flows of plastic and recycled plastic, right? So how do we separate? Working with informal waste pickers can be a part of the solution since they can provide highly valuable data on the inputs that they recover and bring into the recycled plastics chain, but that's just a beginning. So we also need to look at trade barriers, tariffs, regulation around alternatives to plastic. We think that transition will be key to building more sustainable economies. So again, Carolyn, I feel like I don't want to take up too much time today. We could go through a number of steps around the need for greater transparency, both for businesses and also for moving plastic waste through the value chain from country to country and how these policy and plastic waste policies and managements need to be much more transparent, how we can create the right kinds of targets and move these supply chains to actually create greater needs and greater opportunities within the circular economy. We recognize the importance of trade facilitation to bring these needs to life and to bring the opportunities to bear in a number of the different countries with which we are operating today. So maybe in sum, I'll just reiterate that countries can't do this alone, and no single country has the resources or the technology actually to deliver what they need with the interconnectedness of these supply chains. And therefore, I think this is great that we're pulling together so many people in the panel today to really talk about solutions that we need for efficient, safe trade. And again, many participants have already highlighted a lot of that before me. So I'll wrap up there, and I thank you for your time and the invitation once again.
Great, thank you very much, Kristen. It's really useful to hear the sort of more practical perspective from an organization that's really working with stakeholders who are trying to make this recycling and greater use of recycled content work. As we heard from Winnie at the beginning, it's not the whole picture, but we need to have that piece of the puzzle work better and more efficiently. And so I think the work that you're doing to look at how we can facilitate trade to do what we want it to do better in this sector is really, really important, and ought to be part of this discussion as we go forward on how the trading system can help. And I really appreciated the point too, and I think it applies to all of this trade and plastics discussion, that there's very little that one country can successfully do alone. And that's why to the extent that we can get countries to cooperate together and understand better the trade-related challenges and opportunities, the better we will be. So hence this panel today, which is already a great step in that direction. So we are running rapidly out of time. We did start about 10 minutes late, so the organizers, as I said, have allowed me to go a little over. So I'd like to open the floor for discussion. There are a couple of questions posted in the chat. And I'm going to ask various speakers to reply to those, but also I think in the interest of time, we'll just go through each speaker one at a time, and they may also have comments on what others said on the panel. But there was a specific question here around what characteristics are important when we think about sustainable alternatives and substitutes to conventional plastics. And I thought Winnie might be willing to take a look at that, and also to what extent we have data on plastic waste management facilities worldwide. The second, there was a question about what's the liability of shipping companies for non-compliant shipments. I'm hoping that Carlos may be able to help us on that. There was also a question that perhaps Carol can help us with, is that whether there are lessons that can be learned from the Montreal Protocol example. And there was a question around the technical regulations that are being notified to the WTO, and to what extent they're looking at the question of packaging specifically. But just before I turn back to the speakers, I did promise the floor to Shuaohui Zhang from the Chinese mission to the WTO, and he's been very actively involved in trying to promote discussion among with Fiji and Morocco and Sri Lanka and other WTO members to promote discussion on plastic pollutions and trade. So I've asked the organizers to unmute him. He wanted to make a brief intervention. I'm not sure, Shuaohui, are you there?
Hello,
Great.
Caroline, can you hear?
Please take the floor, yes.
Okay, thank you, Caroline. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share some information from China. I'm quite excited today to participate in this dialogue. You know, as the college from Basel Convention mentioned about the joint enforcement operation, Dimeter 5. At that time, I'm also the contact point from China. Now I'm contact point, focus point from China on the initiative in WTO regarding the trade and plastic pollution. As many speakers already mentioned about that the plastic pollution has serious impact on the global sustainable development, and the trade dimension is obviously an integral part of the efforts to promote a more sustainable plastic economy. The WTO agreements require members to protect and preserve the environment and to enhance the means for doing so. And the ongoing WTO reform process also makes the WTO more relevant in this regard. We think that the value added could provide by the WTO is helping members to develop more coordinated, coherent, and effective trade-related approaches while avoiding fragmented policies. China now is making its contribution in this process. I would like to share some information from China. At the national level, China attaches great importance to plastic pollution and has taken a series of measures, starting from the ban on production, sale, and use of certain kind of plastic shopping bag in 2008. And we made a lot of progress in recent years, especially in this year. We released a guideline and amended the law with a view to furthering the efforts in prohibit and restrict on certain plastic products and promoting recycling biodegradable alternative ones. Back to the WTO, last year, China, together with Sri Lanka, Morocco, and Fiji, hosted a series of workshops on how the WTO could help to address plastic pollution. Through all those events, members realized that the necessity and urgency to improve transparency, promote best practice, encourage trade in green plastics and substitutes, and start to explore trade-related measures in encouraging companies and consumers to shift toward more sustainable plastic and substitutes. Recently, as many speakers already mentioned, that WTO members are promoting dialogue and information sharing on environment trade intersections, including on climate change, circular economy, the sustainable use of biodiversity, etc. The effort of tackling plastic pollution, we believe, could be a concrete and practical step to support other efforts to achieve the SDGs. In particular, to protect and conserve the environment and its biodiversity, to address climate change and encourage transit to a low pollution, resource efficient, more circular and climate resilient economy. At the recent CTE meeting in July, many delegations signaled their support for continuing discussion on plastic initiative in the WTO. For the next step, interested members would like to focus on improving transparency. And we believe that first we need to identify challenge and gaps before we can develop solutions. Of course, WTO could not address the challenge in isolation. Rather, it should aim to be one part of a large solution by focusing on the trade dimension of the challenge and by working coherently with other relevant entities and stakeholders. Personally, I thank to all the speakers today for your contribution to the issues of trade and trade policy in the fight against the plastic pollution. The presentations are very relevant, informative, and enlightening for the WTO members. We sincerely hope that our international organization, think tanks, and the business community would continue to lend your support to our efforts in the WTO. I will stop here. Thank you for your attention and look forward to hearing more suggestions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Shuahui, for that intervention. I thought it would be useful for everyone to understand a little more about the discussions that have already been underway at the WTO on this issue. And I think one of the key things to do is to try and link them up with some of the discussions going that are underway also on the treaty that Carol mentioned, and also on the supply chain side with stakeholders as well. So I'm just going to turn to the floor. I think we'll just take it from the top. So we're starting with Winnie, if you'd like to just offer any comments on the questions and closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carolyn. You know, when we were modeling the substitute solutions and interventions, we did take take into consideration, environmental, social, and economic impacts. So, from the environmental considerations, we looked at impacts to climate change. What are the greenhouse gas emissions footprints of different materials? Will it affect any land use changes because of how materials are sourced? And then most importantly, how biodegradable are these substitutes really in the environment, in all the different areas that they would be found. So, there are also social considerations. In our assessment, we had 4 tests. We looked at, what the costs might be. We also looked at, whether a substitute material has the performance needed for the function, and also, whether it's acceptable and to consumers, and whether if it's convenient for consumers to make the switch. So there are multiple dimensions to looking at substitute materials, and we looked at the problem at a global level and looked at materials that could be scaled globally in the next 20 years. But I completely agree with David from UNCTAD, who said that there are other materials, and I think we do need to put some emphasis into innovation. But as we evaluate new materials that come up, we do have to come up with some criteria to assess whether they are actually a better replacement for plastic, or are we replacing with a material that can have other implications on the environment?
Great. Thank you very, very much, Winnie, for that. I'm going to turn swiftly I'm going to switch around the order a bit. I'll go to Carlos, please.
Thank you, Caroline. Yeah, I will try to answer some of the questions. One of them is about databases on facilities to treat waste in different countries. I'm not aware about any comprehensive database in the world addressing that, but there are some bits and pieces of information. One of these is a report from the OCDE that can be found in their web page on OCDE.org/environment/waste/policy-highlights-improving-plastics-management PDF. There is information on facilities there. It's also a document that we prepare for the first meeting of our plastic waste partnership. That is a multi-stakeholder, private institutions, academia, governments, etc., who are meeting together to find solutions on the plastic problem. And we've submitted to them a document that can be found in our website. Is UNEP/CHWU-PWG.1inf/4 that you can find information there on these facilities. Regarding some comments that I read on the US proposal to the OCDE regarding the Basel amendments, the information I got is that the OCDE members have agreed to disagree. That means that under the OCDE rules, members of the OCDE are bound, have not considered, have not agreed on the proposal from the US, and therefore are bound by their international obligations, in this case, the Basel Convention, among others, and the existing national legislation. So this is not an issue anymore. Regarding the Montreal Protocol, what are the lessons? Well, to start with, I think the Stockholm Convention is more successful than the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol deals with a handful of substances, has very successfully managed to reduce the production and ban the production of some of them. A number of substances and impacts on health and environment. What the Stockholm Convention has done on POPs is probably several levels higher in magnitude. But still, there is a lot of important lessons we learned from the Montreal Protocol, why they have achieved so much in so little time, and it's because of the multilateral fund. There is a specific, quite substantive multilateral fund that is devoted to implement decisions of the Conference of the Parties. It's a direct link between governance, the governance and priority setting of the Conference of the Parties of the Montreal Protocol, and the money that is sent to parties to implement these priorities. And furthermore, there are some conditionalities for member states to receive money from the multilateral fund if they fully comply with the provisions of the protocol. So this is an important lesson to learn from there, that we don't have this benefit from other conventions. And finally, there's another question I read about the liabilities of shipping companies. For this, I would like to refer to the Article 9, paragraph 2 of the Basel Convention that I can read quickly. In case of a transboundary movement of hazardous waste or other waste deemed to be illegal traffic as the result of conducting on the part of the exporter or generator, the state of export shall ensure that the plastic waste in questions are A, taken back by the exporter or the generator, or if necessary by itself, into the state of export, or if impracticable, B, are otherwise disposed in accordance with the provisions of this convention within 30 days, from the time the state of export has been informed about the illegal traffic and follows and so on. So there are clearly some liabilities from the exporting companies through the export countries that has to have their national legislation to implement this provision of the convention.
Okay, Carlos, I'm going to jump in there because we've just received a message from our organizers that it's time to wrap up. So I'm going to quickly fly to Carol, please. Sorry, I said it with a French accent. Carol, sorry.
Thanks, Carolyn. I'll keep my remarks very brief, but I want to respond to that fundamental question of substitution. And I want to highlight that to a greater extent than any other commodity, any other product stream that we've seen, the use of plastics is driven much more by supply than it is by demand. This is an industry that aggressively goes out and creates new markets and creates demand. One of the benefits of that is, as Carolyn noted in her introductory remarks, one of the major drivers of plastic demand growth is demand for single-use disposable plastics. In many cases, the alternatives there are less about substitution than about no need for this product at all. So there are large categories of plastic products for which there's simply no need. For still other categories of plastics products, we can fundamentally reduce the amount of material used by simply changing the way the product is delivered. If you take the water out of toothpaste, out of shampoo, out of detergent, you have dramatically reduced the amount of material you need, and you've simplified the characteristics that material needs to meet. So all of this is a way of saying that the solutions to the plastic trade crisis and the plastic crisis itself are actually enormous if we don't trap ourselves into simple questions of one-to-one substitution. And the final thing that I'll note in this regard is that plastics ultimately are driven by the economics of oil and gas. Those economics themselves are fundamentally changing, which means that the economics that underlie the plastics economy everywhere it occurs are themselves in a period of rapid transition. And to assume that this is going to be a profit center going forward is, I think, not in alignment with the evidence that we're seeing.
Great. Thank you, Carol. I'm going to dive quickly to Diana and then to Kristen, and then I'm going to close in super quick. Diana, please.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be super quick. I think all the speakers have really added something that's so wonderful to this meeting. And what I would like to say is that, who would have imagined 2 years ago that we would be having such expertise and interest in this topic? I don't know how you will find, but after I come back from any of these meetings, talking with my family, everyone is so pumped up and excited about what we're trying to do. And, as a trade economist, that doesn't happen every day. So I think the thing is we're all working for something really great. And everybody, as Carolyn says, different pieces of the puzzle, all these pieces coming together. Thank you for everyone.
Great. Kristen, and then I will close.
Well, I hate to take time away from you, Carolyn. You are the shining star here, wrapping us all in one sellotape hug. So, especially during COVID. So simply let me say thank you again to you and to the panelists. This is definitely something that needs to be addressed by many and many organizations, many countries, many governments, many businesses, civil society, etc., academics like yourself. And so thank you for bringing us together today. And I look forward to working with the panelists and others around the table to really address this issue. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Kristen. So I think that collectively we've made a clear case for the relevance of trade policy to the plastic pollution challenge and the one of transforming the plastics economy. I think we've made a clear case for a more integrated and coherent approach, and that there are multiple pieces of this puzzle. And I would say, you have all made a range of excellent policy proposals. And I'm sorry I don't have time to summarize those, but I would say I hope we, as the organizers and those of you on the panel, have the chance to meet again in different formats. We've shown that there's interest in this issue, and that inspires me at least to take forward more discussions in the coming months, including getting together a diversity of stakeholders and the best possible evidence. One necessary next step, I think, is to try and just boost monitoring and analysis of this issue, to try and bring together more information on trade flows, more transparency of the measures that are there, more understanding of national experiences, where the critical challenges lie, and to pinpoint the opportunities, both in terms of policy options and the fora in which it's most appropriate to take action. So to close, I'd like to thank the organizers from the Geneva Trade Week for their patience with us this afternoon, for running a little late. Thank all of our speakers for their participation. It's really been a pleasure to have you all on the panel, and to the audience for joining with us. And I really look forward to hopefully taking this dialogue forward. So thank you again, everyone, for your time.
Thank you, Carolyn.